14. Put on then, as God-chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and, if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so that you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony.
There is one health update that we failed to share with you this morning, and it's regarding Holly Witt. She is hospitalized at Northside Gwinnett fighting an infection, but she has she's immunocompromised, so no visitors at this time, but they are requesting prayers for her as they try to figure out what's causing the infection and that she can get that resolved and get out of there as soon as possible. So let's begin this morning by raising Holly Witt in prayer to our Lord. Lord, we come before you right now, grateful for this opportunity we have to study your word, but Lord, these opportunities also give us a chance to share with you those things that are on our heart. And we are mindful right now of Holly and the infection she's battling at the hospital right now. It's our prayer that the doctors will resolve that, figure out what's going on, and treat it correctly so that she can rid herself of the infection and be back with us. Our prayer is you be with her while she is in this immunocompromised state, and may there be no setbacks or challenges that occur, and may you continue to bless her health at this time. We bring her to your feet, Lord, because you are the great physician. Since you designed the human body, you know it better than any medical professional, and we ask that you be involved in her healing at this time. It's through the name of your Son, Jesus, that we pray. Amen. I heard about this preacher who was known for preaching long sermons. This is not an autobiographical story, by the way. And on one particular Sunday, he noticed a man get up in the middle of his sermon and start walking towards the back doors. And so he said to that man from the pulpit, "Where are you going?" And the man replied, "I'm going to get a haircut." And the preacher said, "Well, why didn't you get one before you came to worship?" The man said, "Well, I didn't need one before I came to worship." That little bit of humor, it illustrates well the connection we typically establish between patience and time. You know, the first thing that most of us probably thought of when I introduced this series on patience was the idea of waiting. In fact, I leaned into that last Sunday night, if you were with us, where we talked about how oftentimes we find ourselves worshiping the God called now. Waiting is typically what comes to our minds when we deal with the subject of patience. Typically, when we use phrases like be patient or have patience, we're encouraging someone to wait. And while that type of patience is talked about in the Bible, I don't think it's what Paul specifically had in mind when he wrote the passage we read just a moment ago in Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, where patience is one of those attributes, one of those virtues, one of those characteristics that we're instructed to put on or to clothe ourselves with. Patience is much bigger than just our relationship to time. In fact, the language of putting on or clothing ourselves with these virtues implies that they're not characteristics that come naturally. Just as we're not born fully clothed, we're not born with the virtues of compassion and kindness and humility and meekness and patience and love. All of those characteristics must be learned. So just as we have to put clothes on before we leave the house, Paul says we have to put on certain attributes. And one of those attributes is patience. But I don't guess Paul ever woke up and had to commute to Atlanta before, right? What Paul is talking about when he mentions patience here isn't just having to deal with long waits. He's not telling us that we need to clothe ourselves with the ability to endure a long line at the drive-thru or wait in heavy traffic on 85 or 285, whichever interstate you're on. I think he's referring to something more. Last week, we introduced this series on patience by examining how patience manifested itself in the character of God. Our premise was that in order to understand the fruit of patience, we first need to understand the originator of the fruit. And in that lesson, we defined patience two different ways. We defined it in terms of endurance, which has to do with the ability to put up with opposition or suffering for an extended period of time. We also defined it as forbearance, a word we don't use very often, but forbearance has to do with the ability to put up with other people, with their weaknesses and their failings. In other words, patience can refer to tolerating a period of time or tolerating a particular person. And it's this latter of these two concepts that Paul is referring to here in Colossians chapter 3, when he tells us to put on patience. And this is evident from the fact that all of the characteristics we're told to clothe ourselves with have a relational function. Compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and even love, if you skip down there to verse 14, they're all characteristics that impact our relationships with others. Now, I know there are probably some husbands in here who are saying that my waiting on my wife is impacting my relationship with my wife, but that's not what we're really talking about. When you think about compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, and love, all of these are characteristics, all of these are traits, all of these are attributes that affect how we relate to other people. So we need to understand the patience that is being called for in this passage is the type that falls under that category of forbearance, of putting up with the weaknesses and the failings of other people. And what I want us to understand this morning, what I want us to spend our time focused on this morning as we study the fruit of patience, is I want us to understand what patience looks like in terms of our relationship with other people. Not just in our ability to wait, but in how we interact with others. This might just be the most important aspect of patience for us, because it affects our relationship with other souls. So, as we appeal here to Colossians chapter 3, there are really two basic things. I'm really taking it easy on you guys lately. Last week I had 2 points. This week I've got 2 points. It's just becoming elementary in here. But first thing I want you to understand about patience as we look at Colossians chapter 3 is that patience, if you're going to have it regarding your relationship with other people, patience necessitates selflessness. Patience necessitates selflessness. Now, I know that you can look at Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, and nowhere in those verses do you see a reference to being selfless, or do you see the term. But the idea is present. I want you to think for just a moment about these terms, these attributes, these characteristics, these virtues that Paul is telling us we need to put on. He starts by saying, put on compassionate hearts. Compassion is associated with sympathy, with pity, with concern for other people. That's a relational attribute that is focused on others. Or you think about the term kindness. Kindness is associated with being friendly and generous and considerate of other people. That's a relational attribute that puts the focus on others. And then Paul says, put on humility. Humility in Paul's own terms refers to counting others more significant than yourself. Obviously, a relational concept that focuses on others above the self. And then there's even meekness. That's another one of those terms we don't use that often. The Greek word from which we get meek, it was used in the days of Jesus to refer to the taming of an animal. That's why you'll find it used in that passage where he talks about yokes and that we should take on his yoke, which is light. And so the idea behind the term meekness refers to someone who doesn't insist on their own way, but is willing to surrender to the will of another. An animal that has been tamed. It's a relational term that puts the focus on others above the self. So all of these characteristics that Paul calls on us to put on before he ever gets to patience have to do with qualities that are concerned more with the needs and the wishes of others than with one's own needs and wishes. And since patience is next on that list in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12, we can assume that it must fall within that selfless framework as well. See, the reason we can associate patience with selflessness is because when you are patient with other people, you are deciding that your wounds or your frustrations or your grievances or your concerns or your interests or your needs are not as important as the relationship or the soul with whom you are being patient. Patience is about saying, I can forego what interests me, what I want, what my desires are, what my agenda is, because I want to forbear them. I'm going to pass over myself because I'm more concerned about that individual. I'm more concerned about building a relationship with him or her. I'm more concerned with their soul and their situation than I am my own. When we are impatient with someone, it typically says more about us than it does them. Because when we're impatient with someone, we're saying that what I want and need right now is more important than what you want or need right now. And when we think about this type of impatience, I can't help but think of Joseph. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, Connor did a great, fantastic, wonderful lesson on Joseph. How can you forget how, now, wow? That's going to stick with you, and if you haven't heard that lesson, go check it out. It was a great overview of the life of Joseph. I'm not about to repeat all of it, mainly because I'm not wearing white high tops, and it just wouldn't look right. But think about Joseph for a moment. If you're unfamiliar with Joseph's story, you can read it starting in Genesis chapter 37. And I am going to read a few sections of his life just to give us context. But what fascinates me about Joseph's life is his patience. Not so much his patience with time, even though his story does span a 13-year period of horrific events, but it's his patience with people. So when Joseph's story starts, it starts with him being mistreated. In Genesis chapter 37, beginning in verse 3, we read the following. Now Israel, that's Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his sons because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, hear this dream that I have. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field. And behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now he has a second dream. Same concept in that dream. He tells it to his brothers and his father as well. And you know what? His brothers were told, hate him even more. He's just compounding their hatred by telling them these dreams. And not only that, but he tells his dad, and his dad rebukes him. Everybody is mistreating this guy, either because he's daddy's favorite or because he has these fantastic dreams. And you know what? I personally don't think Joseph's being a brat going around telling these dreams because he wants to rub it in his brother's face. I think he's telling these dreams because he's perplexed by them. These are unique and intriguing dreams, and dreams meant something to people back then. And he's telling them to his brothers, he's telling them to his father, because he doesn't necessarily fully understand them. And he has questions, and he's looking for clarity. It doesn't make sense to him just as much as it doesn't make sense to them. And I think what Joseph is doing, he's trying to share this. He's trying to bring people into his experience because he doesn't fully wrap his mind around it. And what does he get for that? Mistreatment. In fact, if we keep reading in his story and we jump down to verse 23 of Genesis 37, here's what happens. All his brothers are off taking care of the sheep in the pastures, and Dad says, "Joseph, I need you to go check on them for me." Joseph dutifully does his job. And when Joseph arrives on the scene, this is what unfolds. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. And they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Wow. What a great brother. Instead of killing him, let's just sell him into slavery. Let's make some money off of him. That's Joseph's story. He ends up a servant in Egypt under a guy named Potiphar because his brothers are just absolutely the worst people on the face of the earth. The amazing thing to me is, as you read Joseph's story, there's not one time you're going to find him complaining about his brothers. There's not one time while he's in Egypt that you're going to see him reminiscing and sharing with other people how much he can't stand his brothers, how horrible they are, and when he gets a chance, he's going to get revenge. We never get that side of Joseph. What we do get is at the end of the story. See, Joseph, while in Egypt, rises through the hand of God to become the second most powerful person in Egypt, only inferior to Pharaoh. And because he has dreams, he has this ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And in so doing, prophesies that there's going to be 7 years of great harvest and 7 years of famine. Pharaoh listens to those interpretations and has Joseph put in charge of saving up some food for the really bad years. So when those bad years hit, Joseph then is in charge of distributing that food. And lo and behold, his brothers have to come searching for food because they don't have any where they are. When they arrive on the scene, they have to encounter the brother they sold into slavery. He now has the opportunity to get even. But instead of using his newfound position to seek personal vengeance for all the wrongs and injustices he experienced at the hands of his brothers, he looked towards what God was doing. And in Genesis chapter 45, verse 4, so Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." He's not letting them forget what they did. He's just not necessarily holding it over their heads. Because he says, and now in verse 5, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God." See, Joseph's patience is evident in his ability to think bigger than himself. In this moment, after 13 or so years of the life he lived, a life that put him as a slave in Egypt, a life that put him as a prisoner in Egypt, a life where he was forgotten and abused and mistreated, it would be easy to come out on the other end and only think about self. It's time for mindfulness of me. It's time to go all Burger King up in this place and have it my way. But not Joseph. Joseph never stopped looking for God's way. His patience with other people, particularly his brothers, was born out of his willingness to be selfless. So if we lack patience with people, it may be because we're too focused on ourselves. It may be that in order for us to gain patience, we have to lose some of ourself in the process. Because patience necessitates selflessness. But the other thing I notice, if we turn back to Colossians chapter 3, is that patience necessitates second chances. Patience necessitates second chances. Returning to Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12, I think it is vitally important to notice that immediately after Paul tells us to put on patience, he talks about bearing with one another and forgiving each other. This is interesting because these two instructions do not necessarily fit with the put on instructions that Paul will return to in verse 14 when he says, above all these, put on love. It's like the bearing and forgiving instructions were something Paul thought about once he mentioned patience, and he wanted to expound on what that looks like before he went on to conclude his, here's what you need to put on stuff. It's interesting also because there's a similar association found in Ephesians chapter 4 where Paul, between bearing, forgiving, and patience, in Ephesians chapter 4 verses 1 and 2, Paul instructed Christians to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. There's a similar connection there with patience and bearing that we find here in Colossians chapter 3. See, bearing with each other and forgiving each other are expressions of patience. Their association with patience indicates that patience includes not holding grudges. Patience includes giving second chances. Patience includes turning the other cheek. Patience includes overlooking some wrongs. Patience includes putting up with some things that we might ordinarily want to get even on. Maybe maybe that's why whenever Paul gave instructions to a church or an individual on how to correct those who were wrong, he always included an instruction to be patient. So think about 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 14 and 15. Paul instructed the church there to admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, to help the weak, and to be patient with them all. There are some serious struggles mentioned in this passage. Paul has already called out those who are idle and told them if you don't work, you don't eat. He's already criticized and condemned and chastised them that refuse to contribute, that refuse to cooperate, that refuse to play their part. And now he's telling the church, be patient with them. And then he talks about the faint-hearted and the weak, those who are struggling spiritually, those who are at their weakest points, and he's saying, be patient with them. Patience here is depicted as part of the corrective methodology when it comes to someone who's erring. That your job as the one who's involved in the corrective action is to be patient with those who are being corrected. As if to acknowledge that, hey, this may not be an overnight success. This may take some time. This may take some effort. I also think about 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, where Paul instructed Timothy to preach the word, to be ready in season and out of season, to reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. Even Timothy, this minister that Paul has used in some of the most complicated church situations, his responsibility as he corrects, as he encourages, as he goes about his work of exhorting, rebuking, and reproving, he's supposed to be doing it with patience. For Paul, patience is about correcting those who have erred so that they might have a second chance to do what is right. Maybe that's something he learned from the one guy who gave him a second chance. A guy named Barnabas. You may recall that sometime after his conversion, Paul unsuccessfully tried to meet up with the church in Jerusalem. We read about it in Acts chapter 9, particularly in verse 26, where we're told that when Paul had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was a disciple. What that passage is telling us is that after his conversion, everyone was a little bit suspect of Paul. Is he really a Christian now, or is he just going undercover so he can infiltrate our ranks and bring us down from the inside out? Now that might be us having way too many spy movies and spy novels and other forms of entertainment that involve this very strategy. But I think they had reason for this. I mean, this is a guy who would go door to door and arrest Christians. This was a guy who stood there as Stephen was executed in the streets. This is a guy who got letters of marque from the Sanhedrin so he could go to Damascus and arrest Christians in a totally different territory. But then verse 27 introduces us to Barnabas. Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how on the road he had seen the Lord who spoke to him, and how at Damascus he had preached boldly in the name of Jesus. Now I want you to realize something. Barnabas wasn't there when that light shined on the road to Damascus. Barnabas wasn't there, as far as we know, in Damascus when Paul was preaching the gospel. So what that tells me is that Barnabas took the time to talk to Paul. That tells me that Barnabas took the opportunity, when no one else would, to spend time with Paul, to hear Paul's story, to hear his conversion, to hear the message he proclaimed. Barnabas was willing to take a chance on Paul. And it was a pretty big chance. It was a pretty big gamble. Because if Barnabas is wrong about Paul, Not only is Barnabas' own personal safety at risk, but so is the church's. Barnabas risked his reputation as well as his safety when he took Paul under his wing. And in so doing, he modeled patience. He gave Paul a chance when nobody else would. And the end result was the man who the church was too afraid to accept became its greatest missionary. All because one guy gave him a chance. You see, Barnabas demonstrates the type of patience that embodies grace. Barnabas says, yes, there are do-overs. Yes, that reset button on your Nintendo does work in real life. It doesn't always go that way, but when you have patience, you're willing to offer up the second chance. Now, are there occasions where you have to shake the dust off your feet? Absolutely. Are there occasions where you have to protect yourself emotionally, relationally, mentally, spiritually? Absolutely. But if no one ever got a second chance, where would you be right now? If no one ever got a do-over, would you be right here? If no one ever got to hit the reset button, would you still be within the family of God or even searching for the family of God? Patience in terms of our relationship with other people isn't just limited, is not just limited to our selflessness. It also includes our willingness to offer second chances. Picture on the screen is an oyster. I think you figured that out already. I don't eat oysters. When I'm sick, I have enough snot going down my throat. I don't need more. But oysters produce these beautiful things called pearls. Pearls are magnificent pieces of jewelry. But they're magnificent because of how they're made. Some form of irritant gets inside the oyster's shell, a grain of sand or something like that. And it so irritates the oyster that it starts layering it in this mucousy stuff called nacre. Never heard that word before. Had to learn it. And as it creates these layers, it's polishing this irritant until it forms the beautiful pearl that adorns so many necks. But what interested me as I was preparing this lesson was how long it takes a pearl to be created. You can, and they do, manufacture pearls, in oysters. We process pearls now. You can get them in 6 months. That's a pretty good turnaround. But for a really special, a really good, a really worthwhile oyster, it can take 2 to 4 years. When you want a magnificent pearl, when you want a spectacular pearl, you're looking at one that's going to take you 2 to 4 years to develop. Poor oyster. Suffering 2 to 4 years for you to have that pretty pearl. But that's patience. Putting up with irritants so that you can produce something beautiful. That's what God has called us to produce, to bear, to imitate from him. And that's what Paul is saying we need to put on. This ability, this willingness to put up with some stuff. Because we know the bigger story, the grander scheme, the ultimate objective is more than just our little irritants. And so we're called to put on patience. It may be this morning that you realize you're not a very patient person. In fact, you may be irritated with me right now because you're looking at the clock. You may be irritated because things aren't going your way. You may be irritated because someone has mistreated you and nobody has said anything to them about it, and they've never had to face consequences for it. You may be irritated because things just aren't happening in the timetable you expected them to. You may be irritated because there are just some people in your life who don't embody the characteristics that we're called to put on. All I'm asking you to do this morning, and myself as well, don't look at other people. Just look at yourself. And if you aren't putting on patience, ask yourself why. Is it because you're unwilling to be selfless? Maybe it's because you're unwilling to give people second chances. Maybe it's a whole other reason that we haven't talked about. But the one thing we can all agree on is that God expects us to develop this fruit called patience. If you need help with that today, then we invite you to come while together we stand.